So what the American people need to realize is it's going to be up to the states and it's going to be up to us to do everything we can to exert pressure on the federal government to do the right thing, to exert pressure on our elected officials so that they're not captured. There's something called we call elite capture, where they're paid off and bought by the Chinese Communist Party. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to us to secure our own freedom against this threat, because so far the federal government's failed.
Welcome, everybody, to Conversations That Matter. We have a very special guest today to talk about one of the topics that I think should be at the top of everybody's agenda right now. That is the food security issue, which, of course, we have been talking about for a long time, and the issue is now really coming to a head. Our guest today has studied this. He actually wrote a white paper about it. His name is Tommy Waller. He's the new president and CEO of the very important Center for Security Policy, incredibly significant organization when it comes to understanding the national security threats to our country and also educating our policymakers. Congress, our law enforcement, our intelligence agencies, they are just second to none when it comes to these issues. Tommy spent 2 decades in the Marines, active duty, and also in the reserves. He was deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, the Caribbean. He's been all over the place. His bio is really incredible. You can find it on his website. He's also got a recent white paper called Food Security is National Security, which you would think is kind of common sense, but it isn't necessarily to everybody in Washington, D.C., and there's so much going on in this field. Tommy, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about this white paper, Food Security is National Security. Should Americans be concerned right now? Should policymakers be concerned right now about food security?
Yes, absolutely, they should. And it seems a little odd, right? I mean, the United States is a huge food producer and exporter, but our population is really unprepared in a lot of ways when it comes to actual individual, family, household, county, state, and even national food security. You think about right now, less than 2% of the American population actually makes a living in food and agriculture. So the 98% of us depend on them to feed us. And we don't have the sorts of skills that Americans had, say, 100 years ago when it comes to being able to provide for ourselves. So that's one concern. The other concern is just an overall lack of preparedness, right? So the average American makes 1.6 trips to the grocery store every week and has very little food stored up. Our national strategic stockpile has no food. It used to during the Cold War, but there is no food in the national strategic stockpile. While FEMA does have a series of warehouses with meals ready to eat, or MREs, it's grossly insufficient to actually support the population if there was something that adversely affected our food supply. And there's a lot of things that can and are affecting the nation's food and agriculture industry. And so thank you for having me on to talk about it. I'm excited to wake Americans up, because this is actually something that they can actually do something about it, unlike a lot of other national security topics.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, Tommy. You put together a list of recommendations in this white paper, and you guys describe that as an initial list. I think there's going to be more, but what are some things that everyday Americans could do? What are some things that some policymakers at the local, state, and federal level could do to protect our food security as a nation?
Sure. Well, yeah, the paper actually has recommendations broken down exactly like you just said. So at the federal level, the state level, the individual level. At the federal level, let's just look at policies, right? When you look at the world, we know right now, because they've said it, that there are these gigantic supra-state, so bigger than countries, organizations that are really trying to, quote, reshape the food system of the world. Because they say this, right? The World Economic Forum, for example. You look at Europe. I mean, there are people protesting in France, in the Netherlands, convoys of tractors. There's, these farmers are burning tires on the roads in protest of government policies that are taking out of production massive tracts of land. So we look at that, we have to think to ourselves, what's going on with that? Could that be happening here? Well, it is happening here, right? The Biden administration has announced a gigantic expansion in what's called CRP, the Conservation Program for Land. And so now a lot of us, we love CRP land because it's some of the best hunting and fishing land that's out there, right? It's not a bad thing to have land set aside for nature, for pollinators like bees, for deer, for all these different forms of nature that we appreciate. But when you expand a policy in such a way that 2% of the farmers we talked about before have a greater incentive to make money by taking land out of production, there's going to be a price to pay for that, right? And so what you see is globally, these policies that are shifting us away from the type of food production that we need to support the population at a time when right now, Russia's invasion of the largest breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine, is absolutely crushing their food security, right? So this is going to have a long-term adverse effect on food security.
Tell me, how serious do you think this threat is and how imminent? I mean, we heard Biden last year say publicly during a news conference that food shortages were coming and they're going to be real. Tucker Carlson has spent quite a bit of time on his show talking about these seemingly bizarre fires and explosions going on at food production facilities, distribution facilities. Is there an imminent threat to food security? How serious is it? And should Americans as individuals be concerned? I mean, might there come a time when you go to the grocery store and you don't necessarily find the things that you're used to finding?
Look, I think Americans can go to the grocery store right now and start to see that they're not going to find the things that they're used to finding, or that they're finding them 2 or 3 times the cost of what they can recall, right? So that alone should be an indicator for Americans. You look around, and also just think about the grocery store that you go to get your food. How much food is there? On average, the grocery store keeps about 1 to 3 days worth of food for the normal population around there, right? An interruption to that system, it could basically clear the shelves. Look, I mean, just think about like the Texas ice storm in 2021, hurricanes, how quickly the shelves clear. When you back away from those grocery stores to the regional distribution centers, those may have a couple of weeks worth of food. All of it requires refrigeration. What does refrigeration require? It requires electricity, right? And so this is where like my own the reason why I'm the one that undertook this study is because I kind of have a significant personal interest in this issue, because for a long time I've been looking at the vulnerability of our nation's critical infrastructures like the electric grid, right? You lose the grid, you lose power, you lose refrigeration, you lose transportation, right? And so because America's food is produced by such a small percentage of our population, and because it has to move, on average, the average food product moves 1,500 miles to be consumed. That's an average, right? So you think about just the distances and all of the complex systems involved in growing, storing, moving, distributing, and selling the food. It's all just in time. It all depends on a lot of infrastructure that's vulnerable. And when you ask about, is it imminent? Well, we've seen a 600+% increase in just malware attacks on the food and agriculture industry. We put that in our report. It's one of the cybersecurity firms that found that. Where every other industry, the most you might have seen in an increase was about 50%, right? 607% increase. So from all angles, our food security is under attack, and we know that our adversaries have used food as a weapon, especially the Chinese Communist Party. And they're willing to starve tens of millions of their own people when the CCP took over that country. They have no problem starving Americans.
Yeah, that is such an important point. When we get back from this break, I want to drill down a little bit deeper into Communist China, their role in food issues, and of course the bigger picture with the balloons and stuff. Folks, stay tuned. We're going to be right back.
Sophia paused before the door. It read, Department of Bidigital Convergence. Just inside was a new world, a better world, the one of everlasting life, of no pain, of no loss, of no problem. She entered the chamber and her surroundings changed. She saw around her an infinite field of waving golden grain surmounted by cloudless blue sky. The AI voice whispered gently in her mind, Welcome to the singularity. She couldn't see it and couldn't feel it, but her body had almost instantly been covered by a swarm of tiny gray multi-legged bots that melted through her clothes and into her skin. Not perceiving the nightmare, her eyes had already been consumed and the rest of her body was dissolving as the bots digested her flesh. She felt only a warmth suffusing her being. Drowsy, she drifted to sleep, and her last thought was one of panic. Would she ever wake? Could a nightmare vision like this be an outcome of the much-hyped transhumanist technological singularity? Enter the world of the future as illuminated by the experience of the past in Endgame, the new book by Dennis Barrett, the publisher of the New American Magazine, and find out how the disastrous COVID pandemic response fits with the technocratic elite's thirst to create a transhumanist utopia. get Endgame from shopjbs.org with free shipping with code ENDSHIP, ENDSHIP. Or get Endgame and the Great Reset Collector's Issue of the New American Magazine and get free shipping plus an additional 20% off both with code END20, END20.
Welcome back to Conversations That Matter, folks. Our guest today is Tommy Waller. He's the new president and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. He spent 2 decades active in reserves in the U.S. Marines. He was a lieutenant colonel. Incredible background, and he has actually studied these issues of food security and also China. So now I want to talk about the intersection of those. It's become lately a national issue that the Communist Chinese are coming in and they're buying up huge tracts of land. They're buying up sensitive industries. In fact, they've purchased some of our huge food companies, including one of our big pork producers. Tommy, should we be concerned about Communist Chinese forays into our food infrastructure in this country?
Yes, absolutely, Alex. I mean, just start with the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party itself, right? The CCP, as it's called, used food as a weapon against its own people. The amount of Chinese citizens that died of starvation is in the tens of millions. And I guess if you added it up between the start of the CCP and today, it probably could be over 100 million people. And that's just in the last century, right? And so we know an organization like the Chinese Communist Party would starve its own people. They'll have no problem starving the American people and using food as a weapon. And it's you mentioned a lot of the different areas in which the Chinese have been working to both steal our technology and intellectual property, but also make very strategic purchases of key industries in the food science realm. In fact, the FBI, this is actually one of the best products I've ever seen from the FBI. Last year, they made a little film, a short film called Made in Beijing. And anybody can just go to YouTube, type in Made in Beijing, FBI. It's about 30 minutes long, but it is well worth watching. And you'll see a whole story, one section, where they go through the Chinese espionage effort against one of our large food corporations. And when you watch that, you will get an impression of just how sophisticated the Chinese Communist Party is when it comes to that theft. But that's just, honestly, Alex, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to China and the threat it poses to the United States and our freedom.
Well, let's talk about that threat, Tommy. I think there's a general consensus almost in Washington, D.C. that things are escalating a little bit, although there still seems to be, in my opinion, a little bit of naivete. Is the CCP really a threat to America? Would they actually go to war against us? And if so, what does that mean? How do we deal with that?
So the answer is yes. And in fact, it's been going on for decades, right? So when we think war, we think kinetic combat, right? The Chinese have been at war with the United States for decades with what they call unrestricted warfare. And I would encourage your listeners, again, you can just Google search. There's an English translation to the publication Unrestricted Warfare. You can find it, that translation. And if you were to read just pages 148 to 152 in the English translation of Unrestricted Warfare, written by two People's Liberation Army, that's the Chinese Communist Party military, by two colonels, and you read that excerpt and you look back at just the last couple of years with COVID, you will see how they have flawlessly executed what they planned for decades, right? So the truth is the Chinese Communist Party is at war with America. In fact, last year we wrote a book about it titled "The CCP is at War with America." You can find it on our website. And so it's been unrestricted warfare, which includes economic warfare, what we were talking about before, things, the creative ways like targeting our food supply. But it is very, very swiftly approaching the point at which it will be kinetic. But what we all have to recognize when we look back at this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, whether or not that virus was purposely released from the laboratory in Wuhan as a biological weapon, the Chinese Communist Party inflicted upon us a biological warfare attack by all of the actions it took to purposely enable it to spread worldwide and to misinform the WHO, and then really encourage the United States and others to follow what we call the China model of lockdowns and mandates that devastated our economy. So the answer, Alex, is that we are at war. Anybody who thinks, well, could they go to war with us? doesn't realize that we're in the game already and we're losing fast.
Yeah. What you just said is so critical, and I wish more people in Washington, D.C. understood this. So even while this is going on, you still have American companies, sharing some of their most sensitive intellectual property with the Chinese. You have Chinese spies all over America stealing this property. How does and how should America be dealing with this threat? In your opinion, are we doing an adequate job of preparing and protecting ourselves? And if not, what should we be doing?
Well, I'll tell you, here's how I'd answer that question. For any American that's listening or watching, I want you to think back a couple weeks ago about something that captured the attention of every American, which was this gigantic balloon that transited the entire landmass of the continental United States, every part from West Coast to East Coast. And what did the U.S. federal government do? They let it fly, right? They let it fly the entire landmass of the United States. What could that balloon have been doing? What was it likely doing? Gathering very, very significant meteorological and weather data above our nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM silos and sensitive sites. It could have been a dry run for a nuclear electromagnetic pulse attack, and it transited our entire country, and the federal government didn't do anything until finally there was so much attention that they downed it off the coast of South Carolina. That is indicative of the U.S. federal government's absolute failure to properly respond to China. So what the American people need to realize is it's going to be up to the states and it's going to be up to us to do everything we can to exert pressure on the federal government to do the right thing, to exert pressure on our elected officials so that they're not captured. There's something called we call elite capture, where they're paid off and bought by the Chinese Communist Party. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to us to secure our own freedom against this threat, because so far the federal government's failed.
Yeah, and to build on that, a couple of years ago we interviewed Vincent Peter Pry, the head of the Congressional Task Force on EMPs, and what he said to me, it just shocked me. He said it would be very simple for them to do this, and it would kill about 90% of Americans within the first year. And by the way, we could protect ourselves for about $5 billion, which is the amount of money we send to Pakistan every year in foreign aid. This is incomprehensible to me, Tommy, how this threat could be so real, so huge, and yet Congress and the president and the courts and even our companies seem totally clueless. We're down to just a couple minutes left here, Tommy, but what are some things that an everyday American who's concerned about these things can do? I mean, just give us maybe 2, 3 concrete things that an American can do to try to prepare themselves, to try to get their policymakers doing something useful. What are some things that you would say that people can do?
Sure. Well, look, on the China front, the paper that I just wrote actually tells state leaders what they can do. So, you can find on our website what a failed response to the Chinese balloon should tell state leaders. It's got 8 different examples of 8 different areas where the Chinese have not been met with adequate policy making from the federal government, and examples of where state leaders took action, right? So that's one thing. Familiarize yourself with that. Send it to your state, local, official and say, hey, can you author a bill in our state to prevent the Chinese from buying agricultural land next to military installations, for example? The good thing is we're seeing a lot of that. Right now, members of our team are flying all over the country to testify in legislatures about laws just like this. With respect to the food issue, right? This is an area where people can actually make a difference for themselves. They can be more prepared. The reason why 90% of our population would die in the first year after a loss of electricity nationwide is because they'd starve to death, right? Because we don't have food stored. And so in our report, Food Security is National Security, you download that report, the very last few pages are all the recommendations, but the very last page has a hyperlink to a spot that actually leads, one, because people ask me all the time, what can I do personally, right? And so I just wrote all those recommendations down on a hyperlink you can click through, and you can become more prepared as an individual. But you just got to remember that no matter how much you stock up yourself, it's going to take a community, right? And so what we all need to do is basically spread this information to the people, in our neighborhoods, counties, and our state, and take a bottom-up approach to national security, since it's been failing from the top down.
Excellent advice. Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, the Center for Security Policy, you guys are online. What's the best way for people to stay up to date on the very, very important work you guys are doing?
Sure. Yeah. Just go to securefreedom.org. Securefreedom.org. Sign up for our daily brief and our Secure Freedom Minute. And each day in your inbox, you'll get the latest and greatest of what we're producing.
Excellent. Tommy, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Hopefully we'll get you back with a more hopeful update in the not too distant future. Thanks again. Folks, I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter. Go check out the Center for Security Policy. Incredible work they're doing. That was Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, the new president and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. Go get those white papers and spread the word, folks. Send this to your state legislators, your congressman, your county chair, whatever it is. These are serious issues, and these are all things that we can each as individuals, as voters, and as citizens can be working on. Thanks for watching. This is Conversations That Matter. Until next time, God bless you all.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
The truth is hard to find, but the New American has it. Check it out at thenewamerican.com.